My name is Sarah. I'm 71 years old, and for nearly half a century my family believed I would always just be there. Not in the way you're thinking. Not like a beloved grandmother, seated at the head of the table, being hugged by her grandkids and hearing, "We love you, Mom," before blowing out the birthday candles. Not like that. I was there in the way a power outlet is there, the way a park bench is there, the way the AC is there. No one thanks it while it's running, but everyone complains the second it stops. I was the woman who showed up whenever they needed something, the woman who bankrolled the family's happy memories, the woman who never said no. And that's exactly why, on a Tuesday morning in May 2026, when my phone buzzed with a message in the family group chat, I wasn't surprised by what I read. Hannah, my oldest, wrote it bluntly. No good morning, no hello, not even a question mark at the end of the sentence. We've picked the restaurant, table for 12. You're picking up the tab, as usual. Not an invitation, not a thank you. Not even a simple Happy Mother's Day, Mom. Just the automatic expectation. The absolute certainty that I would show up at the end of the meal to slide my credit card across the table, smile politely, and drive home alone while they kept the party going without me. I stared at the screen for a few seconds. Then I smiled. Not a smile of resignation. Not that tired smile I had learned to use for decades to mask the ache. It was a real smile. Calm. Almost amused. Because for the first time in 46 years, I knew something they didn't. I typed the reply slowly, calmly, word for word. Enjoy your lunch. I'm already on my way to Italy. I hit send. I tucked the phone into my purse, and I kept walking toward the boarding gate. In less than a minute, the replies came flooding in. Hannah said I was being dramatic, that I always did this, turned everything into a scene. My youngest, Robert, sent a rolling eyes emoji, as if his mother had just told a bad joke. My daughter-in-law reacted with a thumbs up, one of those automatic reactions from someone who didn't even really read the text, likely already scanning the menu while her phone buzzed. None of them believed me. They were all certain I'd show up at the last minute, that I'd step out of my car, walk through the restaurant doors with my bag on my arm and my card in my hand, and say something like, "So glad you waited for me." Because that's what I always did. But this time, I wasn't joking. This time, the woman they had turned into a guarantee had bought a plane ticket, packed a suitcase, written 2 letters, and was crossing the Atlantic towards Sicily while they were choosing their wine for lunch. And do you want to know the most interesting part of this whole story? The restaurant they chose to celebrate Mother's Day without me. It wasn't just any restaurant, but that I'll tell you in the next chapter. Because before we get there, you need to understand how a woman reaches the point where she smiles while being forgotten by her own family. You need to know the Sarah who existed before this Sarah. And I guarantee you, this part of the story changes everything. To understand who I became, you have to understand who I was. And to understand who I was, you need to know Joseph Pickett. Joseph wasn't a man of grand gestures. He wasn't the type to come home with just because flowers or write romantic notes or make public declarations of love. He was the type of man who, on a freezing winter morning, would get up before everyone else just to turn on the space heater in the bathroom so it would be warm before I stepped in. The type who never went to sleep without double-checking that every door was locked. The type who, when I said I was fine, would still sit down next to me without saying a word, just so I'd know he was there. Those men don't show up in rom-coms, but they are the ones who sustain a life. We met in 1974 on a Saturday afternoon in my mother's kitchen. He had come over with his older brother to fix a burst pipe, and I was preparing a roast, chicken that smelled so good, he stopped dead in the kitchen doorway and stared as if he'd never seen anyone cook before. "Did you make that?" he asked. "Is there anyone else in here?" I replied without even turning around. He laughed. And that laugh, open, genuine, completely unguarded, was the first thing that made me really look at him. We got married 2 years later. We had very little money, a lot of work, and an absurd amount of dreams. Joseph worked for a small food distribution company, worked part-time at an accounting firm, but my head was always in the kitchen, always on the recipes my mother had taught me, on the flavor combinations I'd invent on my own, on the notebooks I filled with scribbles that no one but me could read. It was Joseph who first said out loud what I had never dared admit to myself. We were sitting on the porch after dinner. He had his coffee. I had my recipe book in my lap. When he looked at me and said, "Sarah, you know what you do is extraordinary, right?" I thought he was talking about dinner. "No," he said. "I'm talking about you. The way you think about food. The way you turn something simple into something that makes people close their eyes when they take a bite." I waved him off, one of those gestures people use to dismiss a compliment. He wouldn't let me. "One day you're going to have your own place," he said. "And I'll be there at the door every morning helping you open up." It took me 3 years to believe he was serious, and another 5 for the dream to become a reality. The restaurant didn't happen overnight. It grew out of a small business loan that cost us countless sleepless nights, out of a fixer-upper building we bought for a song because it was literally falling apart, out of entire weekends spent renovating, out of furniture we scavenged from estate sales, and out of recipes I tested 100 times until they were exactly right. Joseph handled the numbers, the vendors, the contracts, all the things I didn't have the patience to manage. I handled the soul of the place, and the place had soul. I can say that for sure. People didn't go there just to eat. They went because they left feeling something. They couldn't explain it. It took me years to understand it myself. But there was something in those walls, at those tables, in that scent that filled the air from 6 in the morning that made people want to come back. During the early years, I was in everything. I opened, I closed, I cooked, I served, I cleaned, I picked the music, I watered the plants at the entrance. Joseph used to say I was the heart of the place, and I'd say he was the spine. Without a heart, there's no life. Without a spine, there's no structure. We needed both. The kids came. First Hannah, then Robert, then little Clara, whom we lost before. She turned 2, a story I still can't tell today without feeling the ground give way beneath my feet. Life went on, as life always does, sometimes with kindness, sometimes with none at all. Over time, the restaurant grew. We hired chefs, expanded the space, earned recognition. The name of the place started appearing in guides, in newspaper columns, in conversations with people I'd never met but who said they'd grown up, going there with their parents. And it was exactly at that moment that I began to disappear. Not all at once. Gradually. First, it was Hannah's pregnancy that pulled me out of the kitchen for months. Then it was the toddlers who needed me at home. Then it was Joseph, who started hiring people to fill the spaces I'd left. Not out of malice, but because the restaurant couldn't stop while I was taking care of the family. And while I was taking care of the family, other people took center. Stage in the place I had created. My name moved to the background. In the stories told internally, I still existed. The older chefs knew who I was. The accountant who'd been with us since the start knew. The suppliers Joseph had cultivated for decades knew. But to the new customers, to the people who arrived after the 90s, I was a distant reference. The founder's wife, the lady who created the original recipes, a footnote in a story that had grown beyond me. And me? I let it happen. Not without pain, but I let it. Because there were children to raise, because there was a house to run, because there was always someone needing something, and I was the person who knew how to fix it. That was the choice that would define the next 30 years of my life. Joseph died in 2023. Pancreatic cancer. Fast, cruel, leaving no time for much else besides holding his hand and trying to memorize every detail of the face I had loved for nearly 50 years. At the end, when he was too weak to sit up for long, he asked me to bring him the old recipe book. That yellowed notebook that had started on our porch all those years ago and had grown into volumes over the decades. He flipped through the pages in silence for a long time. Then he closed the book, placed it in my hand, and said only, "Don't let this die, Sarah." I promised him I wouldn't. What I didn't know was that he had hidden something between the pages of that paper he had folded carefully and placed exactly in the middle of the recipe I'd made for our wedding. Not just any pages. Those pages. I didn't find the letter immediately. In the months following the funeral, I couldn't bring myself to open the book. It sat there on the shelf in his home office, which I kept untouched for almost a year, because walking into that room was still too hard. When I finally went in to organize his things, when I right there, on the rug of Joseph's office, and read, he started by saying he knew I'd be okay, that he'd always known. That of the two of us, I was always the strong one, and that he understood I'd never believed that, but it was true. Then he wrote about the children, with care, with love, but with an honesty that surprised me even after all those years of marriage. Hannah will keep thinking the world revolves around her. Robert will keep taking the path of least resistance. It's not their fault, Sarah. It's ours. We never let them want for anything, and now they don't know what it means to actually need. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I continued. If you're reading this, I've gone first. The kids are adults now. They have lives, families, stories of their own. And you're still there, solving their problems, paying their bills, being the safe harbor they never stop to thank. I had to stop reading for a few minutes. When I continued, the last part of the letter said this: "Don't lose another decade waiting for them to discover who you are. Go live your life, Sarah. You gave me the best years of your life, and I received every one of them with gratitude. Now you have the right to give the next years to yourself. Go. Cook in new places, meet people who don't know who you are yet and who will be amazed when they find out. Remember what you used to say when we opened the restaurant? That food is the language everyone understands. So go speak that language to the world. I'll be proud of you, wherever I am. With love, and missing you even before I'm gone. Joseph." I folded the letter very carefully. I put it back between the pages of the recipe book. And I sat on the rug of Joseph's office for a long time, looking out the window at the garden he had planted, and that I had kept watering without really knowing why. I thought about how many times he had tried to tell me this while he was alive. I thought about how many times I had changed the subject. I thought about how it's possible to spend 50 years beside someone who knows you better than you know yourself, and still spend decades not believing what that person sees in you. That afternoon, on the rug of that office, something began to shift inside me. But the real turning point, the one that would make all of this possible, was still to come. And it would arrive in the most terrifying way imaginable. It was an ordinary Tuesday in October. At least, that's how it felt at the time. I had woken up early, as usual. I made coffee, watered the backyard plants, set aside the bills that needed to be paid by the weekend, and was washing the breakfast dishes when I felt it. It wasn't an explosive pain like in the movies. It wasn't that dramatic chest clutching that makes a person collapse with their hands over their heart. It was subtler than that. A strange pressure in the center of my chest, like someone was pressing their palm there from the inside out. A sudden fatigue that made no sense. A tingling in my left arm that I tried to ignore for almost 20 minutes. 20 minutes. I stood there in the kitchen trying to convince myself it was stress, that it was indigestion, that it would pass. This is the thing no one tells you about women and heart attacks. We take forever to take them seriously, because our whole lives have taught us to downplay what we feel so we don't inconvenience anyone. I could have stayed in that kitchen for another 20 minutes. But for some reason, that day, I heard Joseph's voice in my head with strange clarity. "Stop, Sarah. Stop now." I called 911. The next few days were a blur of tests, monitors, doctors with careful expressions, and children appearing at the hospital with that mix of genuine concern and poorly disguised inconvenience. Hannah arrived with her bag on her shoulder and her phone in her hand, spending most of her time in the hallway making calls. Robert showed up the first day, stayed for 2 hours, and then sent texts asking when I'd be discharged because he needed my signature on a document. I'm not telling you this to make you pity me. I'm telling you because it's important for you to understand what I saw in that hospital, what those hours showed me about the life I had built. I had suffered a minor heart attack. The doctors said it was mild, that I got there in time, and that with follow-ups and lifestyle changes, I'd be fine. They said I had been lucky. I found myself thinking about a strange definition of luck. The cardiologist who handled my case was named Dr. Aris. He was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and a calm, direct way of speaking, the kind of doctor who looks you in the eye when he talks, never glancing at a chart or a watch. During the last consultation before my discharge, he walked into the room, closed the door carefully, pulled up a chair, and sat down beside me, instead of standing over the bed as doctors usually do. He looked at me for a moment before speaking. Then he asked, "Sarah, when was the last time someone took care of you?" I opened my mouth to answer, and I couldn't. It wasn't the dramatic pause of someone searching for the right words. It was the silence of someone realizing, at that exact second, that there was no answer. Dr. Aris didn't fill the silence. He didn't say, "It's okay. You don't have to answer." He didn't change the subject. He just sat there with that quiet patience, waiting. I looked out the hospital window at the gray October sky, and after a long time I said, "I don't remember." He nodded slowly, as if that was exactly the answer he expected, and exactly the answer he wanted me to hear myself say out loud. "Chronic stress," he said then, "isn't just emotional. It accumulates in the body, especially in the heart." He paused. "I'm not saying this is what caused the heart attack, but I am saying your body has been carrying a considerable weight for a considerable amount of time, and bodies don't carry weights indefinitely." I just stared at him. "What do you like to do?" he asked. "Not what you do for others. What do you like to do for yourself?" I had to think about it. That, in itself, said everything. I spent the following days at home, supposedly resting, but actually submerged in a sort of silent inventory of my own life. I grabbed a notebook, not the cookbook, but a new one with a plain cover, and started writing. I didn't have a plan. I just let my hand move and watched what came out. It turned into a list. On one side, I wrote down everything I had done for others over the last 10 years. On the other side, I wrote everything anyone had done for me. The left side filled 3 pages. The right side had 4 lines. I stared at those pages for a very long time, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with that cold, slightly terrifying clarity of someone seeing a number on a scale they didn't want to see, but already knew deep down was there. Over the years, I had turned into a service provider for my own family. And the worst part wasn't that they demanded it. The worst part was that I had allowed it. I had fed that dynamic so consistently that it had become invisible to everyone, including me. It was during that recovery week that I walked into Joseph's home office. For the first time since I had organized his things, I went back into that room without a practical reason. I went simply because I felt like it. because the scent of that room still gave me a strange sense of company. I sat in his chair. I looked at the bookshelves, and then I saw the cookbook. It had been over a year since I'd found the letter. I had read it several times right after finding it, but in the recent weeks, absorbed in daily chores, I had tucked the book back on the shelf and moved on. But that afternoon, with Dr. Eris's words still echoing in my head, I picked up the book again. I opened to the page with the letter. I reread every line. And this time, something different happened. This time, instead of folding the letter back and putting it away, I sat there with it in my hands and allowed myself to feel everything I had postponed feeling since Joseph passed. The longing, the anger, yes, even that. The anger of having lost him before I could do what he asked. And underneath it all, something I didn't expect to find. A desire. A small, timid, almost embarrassed desire to exist after so many years of being buried. The desire to cook somewhere new. To walk into a kitchen where nobody knew my name. To start from scratch. Truly from scratch. And see what was still left inside me. I put the letter back in the know what I was looking for. I just opened the browser and typed, almost without thinking, Culinary Institutes in Italy. What appeared on the screen that night would completely change the course of the story. But before I tell you about Italy, I need to tell you about a call I received 3 weeks later. A call from a number I didn't recognize. A call that would open a box I thought was permanently closed. A call about the restaurant. The phone rang on a Thursday morning. I was in the kitchen, wearing an apron, doing what always calmed me in difficult moments, making bread. Not out of necessity, just for the process. For the smell of the flour, the texture of the dough between my fingers, the predictable rhythm of kneading, resting, shaping. Cooking has always been, for me, the most honest form of meditation. The number on the screen wasn't in my contacts. Usually I wouldn't answer unknown numbers. But there was something about that moment, a sort of quiet instinct I can't quite explain, that made me wipe my hands on my apron and pick up. "Sarah Pickett?" a voice said on the other end. "Speaking." "My name is Dominic Ferrara." A brief pause. "I'm the attorney responsible for the Whitmore family estate. I need to speak with you regarding Pickett's restaurant." I went quiet for a second. Not because I didn't recognize the name, but exactly because I did. Whitmore. To understand what that name meant, I'd have to take you back to 1981. Joseph and I had owned the restaurant for 3 years. We were young, full of energy, but money was tight and the challenges were huge. The building needed renovations we couldn't afford. One of our main suppliers had gone under out of nowhere, leaving us in a bind during a peak season. We were in one of those moments where the difference between staying open and closing was a matter of weeks. That was when George Whitmore appeared. He was a man in his 60s at the time, well-dressed, reserved, who had started frequenting the restaurant a few weeks prior and always ordered the same thing, the herb-roasted chicken I had created, which had become our most popular dish. One night, after the last customers had left and I was closing the kitchen, he asked to speak with me. We sat at one of the back tables. He told me he had owned restaurants for 30 years, that he had seen many good places close due to poor financial management, not lack of talent, and that he believed what Joseph and I had built deserved to keep existing. Then he made a proposal. He would come in as a minority partner. He would provide the capital needed for the renovations and to cover the lean months. In exchange, he would take a small share of the profits until the investment was recovered. After that, the share would be transferred back to us, or whoever we designated. Joseph was suspicious, as was his nature with strangers. But I looked at that man and saw something that was hard to fake. Someone who genuinely loved restaurants. Not as a business, but as places where life happens. We talked for hours that night. In the end, Joseph and I agreed. George Whitmore was a silent partner in the most literal sense of the expression. He provided the funds, tracked the numbers from a distance, showed up at the restaurant every now and then for dinner, but never interfered in decisions. He never tried to change the menu, the style, or the soul of the place. In 1989, once the investment had been fully recovered, he called us for a meeting. Joseph went in thinking it was to formalize his exit from the inn to a permanent share, smaller than the original, with one specific condition: that in the future, if the Whitmore family ever wanted to sell that share, the Pickett family would have the right of first refusal. Why? Joseph asked him. Directly. George was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because this place was built with something money can't buy. And I'd rather keep a small connection to that than profit more and lose the connection." Joseph looked at me. I nodded. We closed the deal. George Whitmore frequented the restaurant for another 15 years. He died in 2004, quietly, without fanfare. The share passed to his heirs, who never had the interest he had in the place. Over time, contact dwindled until it became just a line on an annual balance sheet. I had almost forgotten that story. But the story clearly hadn't forgotten me. "Mr. Ferrara," I said slowly into the phone, "what exactly happened with the Whitmore share?" "The heirs have decided to sell," he replied. "All assets of the estate are being liquidated. And per the original 1989 agreement, you have the right of first refusal." I stared at the bread dough on the counter. "How long do I have to decide?" 60 days. "And the price?" He mentioned a figure. It was significant. Not impossible, but significant. It would require using a considerable portion of the reserves Joseph and I had built up over decades. Reserves that were there for emergencies, for security, for the future. "There's one more thing," the lawyer said before I could respond. "There is another interested party. A group of investors looking to acquire the stake. And they've already signaled an interest in making offers to the other partners later on." I understood what he was saying without him having to say more. "If I didn't buy it, that share would go to people who didn't know the history of the place, who would see the restaurant as an asset, not as what it was." "Thank you," I said. "I need a few days to think." I hung up. I stared at the dough. Then I went back to kneading, slowly, while I tried to organize what I was feeling. I spent the next few days in a strange state of clarity and confusion at the same time. On one hand, there was the had built that security with hard work and discipline, and spending it now, at 71, required an analysis I had to do carefully. On the other hand, there was something that wasn't financial. There was the question I kept hearing at night when the house went quiet and I couldn't sleep. If I don't buy this share, what happens to the place Joseph and I built? And, right after that, another question. What if the same thing happens to the restaurant that happened to me? What if it also ends up in the background, reduced to an asset, losing its soul while other people make the decisions? On the third night without sleeping well, I got up at 3 a.m. and went to the kitchen. Not to cook, just to be there, in the only place where I always knew how to think. I sat in the kitchen chair with Joseph's letter in my hand, in the dark, and read that last part again. "Go live your life, Sarah." And that's when everything connected in a way I hadn't seen before. The restaurant share, the research on culinary institutes in Italy I had done weeks ago and left open in my browser without taking action. Dr. Eris's questions still echoing in my head. They weren't separate things. They were parts of the same answer. The next morning, I opened my computer. I went back to the tab I had left open. The institute was in Sicily. It offered a 3-month program for experienced chefs interested in a gastronomic cultural exchange. They taught Sicilian techniques, and the participants taught the techniques they brought from wherever they came from. At the bottom of the page, there was an email address for applications. I had looked at that address dozens of times in the previous weeks without doing anything. This time, I opened a new message. I wrote my name. I wrote my story. Not all of it, but enough. The kitchen since I was young, the restaurant, the decades of experience, the desire to learn and to teach in a new place. I reviewed it once. I sent it. I closed the computer. I called Dr. Aris and scheduled a follow-up appointment. Then I called Mr. Ferrara and told him I wanted to begin the process of acquiring the Whitmore share. In 2 phone calls. I had made the most significant decisions of the last 20 years of my life, and nobody in my family knew a thing. The response from the Institute came in less than a week. It wasn't common for them to receive applications from people with my background, the coordinator wrote. They were very interested. They wanted to do a video interview. I did the interview on a Saturday afternoon, sitting in Joseph's office, with the cookbook on the desk because it made me feel safe to have it nearby. I talked for almost an hour. About the restaurant, about the recipes, about what I believed food did for people. At the end, the coordinator went quiet for a moment and then said, "Sarah, you would be exactly the kind of person who enriches a program like ours. People who built something real with their own hands and who still have something to say about it." I hung up the call. And I cried. Not from sadness. From something I had forgotten the feeling of. From being seen. In the following months, as the legal processes of the acquisition moved forward and the details of the trip to Italy became concrete, I lived a double life. On the outside, I was the same Sarah as always. I showed up for family lunches when invited. I helped when asked. I listened to my grandkids' stories, my children's complaints, the plans that always seemed, somehow, to include my financial or logistical involvement. On the inside, I was building something. Quietly, silently, without announcing it to anyone. There was only one person who noticed something had changed. My grandson, Caleb. Caleb was 23. He was Hannah's oldest, which in practice meant he had grown up watching a grandmother who solved problems, funded other people's dreams, and smiled when she was clearly exhausted. But Caleb was different from the others, since he was a boy. He had asked questions the adults didn't ask. "Grandma, what did you like to do when you were young?" "Grandma, have you ever been out of the country?" "Grandma, when you cook, are you happy or is it just work?" I had always answered his questions with honesty, which meant that Caleb was likely the person in the family who truly knew me best. One afternoon, while he had stopped by for coffee, he looked at me for a long moment and said, "You look different." "Different how?" I asked. He thought for a second. "Lighter," he said, "as if you've finally made a decision you've been putting off for a long time." I looked at him. "You're far too perceptive for your age," I remarked. He smiled. I learned from the best. I didn't tell Caleb about Italy that day, but I almost did. I held back because I knew that if I told him, I'd risk letting it slip to the others too. And there was something vital about keeping it to myself, for just a little while longer. There was something deeply necessary about having a secret that was entirely mine. Not a secret born of spite, not for revenge, but for the simple fact that, for decades, every decision in my life had been made for the sake of other people. And for the first time, I was making a decision solely for myself. I wanted to hold on to that feeling for a bit longer, until the right moment, which, as I would soon discover, would arrive in a way I hadn't even planned. Because what happened next involved the restaurant, an unexpected proposal, and a revelation that would come to light not by my design, but by life's own hand, and by the specific way fate likes to flex its sense of humor. It was a cold November afternoon when I returned to the restaurant for the first time in years. Not as a customer, not for a social visit. I had been called there by Marco, the executive chef who had been there for nearly 2 decades and had originally been hired by Joseph back when I still made regular appearances. Marco was in his early 50s now, with silver at his temples, an always immaculate apron, and a direct way of speaking that masked a considerable sensitivity for those who paid attention. He had called me a few days prior, after learning through legal counsel that I was acquiring the Whitmore's stake in the business. "Mrs. Pickett," he had said over the phone with a voice that blended respect with something that sounded almost like relief. "We need to talk in person." I arrived early before the dinner rush, when the restaurant was in that state I always loved. The kitchen firing on all cylinders, the aroma of roasting garlic and herbs taking over the air, the tables set and empty with that silent anticipation of people about to arrive. Marco met me at the entrance. He greeted me with a handshake that lasted a second longer than protocol required. One of those handshakes that says much more than the gesture itself. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Thank you for calling," I replied. He led me to the kitchen first. He didn't have to. We could have gone straight to the office, handled the paperwork, and ended the meeting in 30 minutes. But Marco went to the kitchen, and I understood immediately that it was intentional. He wanted me to feel the place before we spoke about it. I stood at the kitchen entrance for a few seconds. The space had grown since the days I worked there. There was more high-end equipment, more prep stations, a more professional flow. But something hadn't changed. A specific scent that didn't belong to any one dish, but to everything combined. Years of cooking soaked into the walls, stories seasoned into the very air. One of the younger line cooks was preparing a reduction that I recognized instantly. It was mine. Not the exact version. It had likely evolved over the years. But the base, the logic of the seasoning, the sequence of ingredients. It was unmistakably the recipe I had created decades ago. I watched without saying a word. Marco stood beside me, also in silence, watching me observe. After a while, he said softly, 80% of the current menu has its roots in your recipes, Mrs. Pickett. The chefs who have passed through here over the years have adapted them, modernized them, but the bones are yours. They always have been. I looked at him. Most of the customers don't know that, I said. No, he agreed, but we know. He then led me to a part of the restaurant I had never visited. During one of the renovations years after Joseph's passing, they had created a semi-private space at the back of the dining room, separated by a crafted mahogany partition. It seated about 20 people and was used mainly for events and rehearsal, dinners. On the wall of this space were photographs, old black and white shots, and those early faded color prints from the 70s and 80s. Photos of the restaurant in its different eras, the original kitchen, the first crews, the first tables, and in the center, larger than the others and framed with care, was a photograph I had never seen before. It was me. I must have been in my early 30s in the photo. I was wearing an apron in the old kitchen, my back to the camera, but my face turned to the side, smiling at someone out of frame. The light was streaming through the kitchen window, creating the kind of glow that looks calculated, but is really just luck being generous. I didn't know this photograph existed. I stared at it for a long time. "Who took this?" I asked. "Joseph," Marco said. "He left it to the restaurant after he passed, along with a note asking for it to be hung here once the space was renovated." Marco paused. The note said, "So that people know where this all came from." I had to turn my face slightly so he wouldn't see what was happening to my eyes. Joseph had done this. While I had spent years believing I was fading into the background, he had quietly ensured that my presence remained within those walls. I saw the plaque right after. It was discreetly mounted at the entrance of the private space, simple bronze with clean lettering. The Sarah Pickett Room, where it all began. I stood in front of it for a time I couldn't measure. Marco stayed 2 steps behind, with the grace of someone who understands that some moments require space. When I finally turned around, he said, "The restaurant never forgot who created it, Mrs. Pickett, even when other things changed." "My family doesn't know this space exists," I said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a realization. "They don't?" he asked, with a surprise that seemed genuine. "No," I repeated. "My children never come here. Not really. Not to know the place." Marco was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, "They come here for dinner sometimes, but they've never asked to see this part." I nodded. That was all I needed to know. We sat in the office afterward. Marco presented the numbers with a transparency I appreciated. The restaurant's financial health was good, better than I expected. The stake I was acquiring from the Whitmores wasn't a majority, but it was significant enough that my presence in the partnership would carry real weight. But it wasn't just about the numbers. "There's a group," he said, choosing his words carefully, "that is interested in the restaurant. Not just the Whitmore's shares, the whole thing." I looked at him. "An investment group," he continued. "They own other spots in the city, and in other states too. Their interest is in scaling the brand, franchising the concept, opening multiple locations." He paused. "It would be lucrative for the current partners." "But," I prompted, because there was clearly a but. Marco looked at the photograph on the wall, the one I could see from the angle where I sat. "But there would be nothing left of this," he said simply. "It becomes something else. A concept. A brand. It loses its soul." I stared at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because with your stake," he said, "you would have enough leverage to block any sale you didn't agree with. The other partners respect the history of the place. If you are on the inside, actively involved, they'll follow your lead." I understood what he was saying. He wasn't asking me to save the restaurant. He was telling me that I was the only person with the history and the standing to do it, if I wanted to. I went home that afternoon with more on my mind than when I had left. I sat on the porch, where Joseph and I used to sit after work, and watch the garden until the sun began to set. A decision was forming inside me that was more complex than simply buying into a partnership. It was the decision to come back, to return to the place I had helped create, not to work the line like I did 30 years ago, not to knead dough at 6 a.m. or close out the registers at midnight, but to be there, to be a real presence, not just a photo on a wall or a name on a plaque that my children had never bothered to read. And along with that decision came another. If I was going to do this, I needed to set things right. Not in the dramatic way they do in movies, with confrontations and speeches and slamming doors, but in an honest way, a real way. Something that said what needed to be said without cruelty, but also without the silence I had maintained for too long. It was that afternoon that I started thinking about the letters. The first letter was the hardest to write, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew too much, and I had to find the right way to say it, without it sounding like an accusation or a grievance, without losing the dignity I was trying to reclaim. I wrote and rewrote for days. The letter wasn't addressed to any specific child. It was addressed to the family, to all of them. It began like this. For many years, I believed that love meant always being available, that being a good mother and grandmother meant never saying no, never putting my own life first, never having needs that might inconvenience you. I learned too late that this isn't love, it's fear, and that by trying to make myself indispensable, I made myself invisible. It went on to talk about the restaurant, about what Joseph and I had built, about the room with my name on it that none of them had ever stopped to see, about the photograph on the wall their father had left as a silent legacy. And it ended with something that took a lot of courage to write. I am not going to Italy to get back at anyone. I am not running away. I am, for the first time in many years, moving toward something instead of standing still waiting for someone to notice I exist. I hope one day you understand the difference. The second letter was shorter. It was for Caleb. Only for him. It said things I had kept inside for a long time. Things he deserved to hear before I left. The details. The letter to the family would be delivered along with the check at Mother's Day brunch, accompanied by an explanation of what the Sarah Pickett room was and how the restaurant was born. The letter for Caleb would be hand-delivered by Marco himself before the brunch began, with a specific request that he read it aloud to everyone, if he chose. I knew he would. Because Caleb was the only one who had always understood that people's stories deserved to be heard, not just assumed. There were 3 weeks left until Mother's Day when I bought my ticket. I did it, alone, at the kitchen computer, with a cup of coffee by my side, and the recipe stared at the screen for a moment. Then I closed the laptop, grabbed the red apron hanging on the pantry door, the one my mother had sewn for me in 1989, and that I had kept all these years for no reason other than being unable to let it go, and put it on the pile of things to pack. That apron was going to Sicily with me, because some things need to be carried with you so you can start over, without leaving behind who you are. The suitcase was ready the night before, and on that final evening, I did one last thing, something I hadn't planned, but felt I needed to do. The cemetery was about 20 minutes from the house. I used to go there regularly in the months after Joseph left. Then less. Then even less. Not because I had forgotten, or because I stopped missing him, but because I learned that the presence of someone you love doesn't stay on a headstone. It stays in the things you do. In the smell of morning coffee. In the way you fold a towel. In the recipes you keep preparing decades later. But that night, I needed to be there. I arrived as the sun was dipping low, painting the sky that specific late afternoon hue that Joseph used to call the time to stop working and appreciate what you have. He said that every time that shade of orange appeared on the horizon, no matter where we were or what we were doing. I brought simple flowers, nothing elaborate. He never liked fuss. I sat on the grass beside the headstone, in a way he would have found completely unsuitable for a 71-year-old woman with a history of heart issues, and I didn't care one bit. I stayed in silence for a long time. I didn't pray exactly. I'm not much for formal prayer. But I talked. The way you talk to someone who isn't there anymore but still feels like a presence, like an internal voice that is sometimes clearer than any external one. I bought the ticket, I said out loud, feeling slightly ridiculous and completely right at the same time. The wind stirred the flowers. The bag is packed. The letters are written. Marco knows what to do. I paused. I've organized everything. Another pause. Except now I'm sitting here thinking that maybe I'm too old to start something new. That maybe I should stay. That maybe they need me in a way I'm just not seeing. I fell silent. Then I said lower, I'm scared, Joseph. It wasn't a supernatural sign that answered me. It wasn't the wind at a dramatic moment, or a bird landing on the headstone, or any of those things that happen in movies to show the universe agrees with your choices. It was just me, sitting on the grass with flowers in my hand, listening to my own thoughts with more honesty than I had allowed myself in a long time. And the thought was this: they don't need me. They need what I provide. There is a massive difference between those two things, and I had spent decades confusing one for the other. Hannah didn't need me. I needed someone to pay the check without asking questions. Robert didn't need me. He needed someone to sign off on legal documents without asking for an explanation. My daughter-in-law didn't need me. She needed an on-call nanny who didn't charge and didn't complain. If I were to disappear, tomorrow, not to Italy but for good, they would definitely miss my credit card long before they ever missed me. And that realization, which should have shattered me, didn't. It set me free. I stayed in silence for a while longer. Then I placed my palm flat against the headstone, the same way I used to place it on his hand when he was sleeping, and I wanted to feel he was there without waking him. "You were right," I said. "As usual." I stood up slowly, with that caution the body demands after a certain age, brushed the grass off my coat, and stood there looking at his name engraved in the granite. Joseph Arthur Pickett. Husband. Father. The man who always turned up the thermostat before I reached the bathroom. "I'll send word from Sicily," I said. And then I walked away. I got home at 8 that night. My suitcase was in the bedroom, zipped up, ready. I made some tea. I sat in the kitchen. I opened my recipe book one last time. Not to read it, just to hold it. To feel the weight of those pages that contained not just recipes, but decades of life noted in the margins, sauce stains that never came out, pencil-written dates marking when each recipe had been tested for the first time. I tucked the book into the suitcase. I put Joseph's letter in with it. I placed my red apron, folded carefully, on top of everything. I closed the bag. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because of anxiety, exactly. It was more like a silent vigil. Like when you know something is changing, and you want to stay awake so you don't miss the moment. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling of the house Joseph and I had bought together in 1979, the one we had renovated bit by bit over the years, that had seen children born and grow and leave, that had seen a man grow old and leave too, and that now saw me, alone within its walls, about to leave by my own choice for the first time. I thought about small things. The porch plants that needed watering. I had asked the neighbor to look after them. She had accepted with that simple neighborly kindness of someone who doesn't ask unnecessary questions. The car in the garage. I'd arranged with Caleb to leave the keys with him. Caleb, whom I hadn't told about the trip directly yet, but who I suspected already knew somehow, with that annoying intuition he'd inherited from God knows who. The fridge, almost empty, which I had deliberately not restocked so food wouldn't go to waste. I thought about these small things and found it curious how a big life sometimes announces itself through the tiny details, the empty fridge, the keys handed over, the plants cared for by someone else. They were all ways of saying, "I'm leaving. I'm really leaving." At 5 a.m, I got up. I showered. I dressed slowly. I brewed coffee and drank it sitting at the kitchen table in the silence of the house before the day began, listening to the birds outside with that specific attention we only give to things when we know we're going to miss them. At 6:30, I grabbed my suitcase and went to the door. I paused for a second in the hallway. There was a photo on the wall, one of the few I had hung after Joseph passed because I couldn't bear to look at many photos at first, and then I'd just gotten used to the emptiness and never put them back. But this one I had kept. It was from our wedding, not the formal one at the altar with everyone staring. It was a shot someone had taken during the reception, when we thought no one was looking. Joseph was whispering something in my ear, and I was laughing with my head tilted back. The kind of laugh that's real, without worrying about the angle. I looked at that photo for a second. Then I opened the door and walked out. The airport that morning had that specific hum of an ordinary day. People with rolling bags, people with Starbucks in hand, people staring at their phones with that expression of being in transit between one life and another. I was one of them. I checked in, dropped my bag, passed through security, found my gate. I sat in one of the terminal chairs and pulled my phone from my purse. I opened the family group chat. There was a message from Hannah sent the night before that I hadn't answered. Remember, lunch is tomorrow. The restaurant is on Acacia Street. Be there at noon. Not a please. Not a we're looking forward to seeing you. Not even a it'll be good to see you, Mom. Just the logistics, the address, the time. I stared at the message. Then I typed my reply. Enjoy your lunch. I'm already on my way to Italy. I hit send. I put the phone back in my purse. And I just sat there, peacefully, as the replies started flooding in. Hannah said I was being dramatic. Robert sent a rolling eyes emoji. My daughter-in-law reacted with a thumbs up without really reading it. Then Hannah again. Mom, stop it. The reservation is already made. Then Robert. You could have given us a heads up. Then Hannah calling this time. I let it go to voicemail. Then Robert calling too. Voicemail. I watched the screen as the notifications popped up, one after another. And what I felt wasn't guilt or anger or that familiar anxiety of someone who is letting someone down and needs to fix it urgently. What I felt was a calm so deep it surprised me. It was the calm of someone who had made a real decision, not one made to please someone else. My flight was called. I stood up, grabbed my carry-on, and joined the line. The woman in front of me was holding a toddler, a little girl about 3 years old who was looking at everything around her with that absolute focus of someone seeing the world for the first time and finding it all equally fascinating. The girl looked at me. I smiled. She smiled back. I don't know why that, of all the moments that morning, was the one that hit me hardest. Maybe because there was something in that gaze without a backstory, without expectation, without a version of me that needed to be confirmed or denied. She just looked at me as someone who was there, in that moment, and smiled because I had smiled. Simple as that. I boarded the plane, found my seat, stowed my bag in the overhead bin, sat down, buckled my belt. I looked out the window as the plane began to taxi. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't think about anyone I had left behind. I thought only of what was ahead. While I crossed the Atlantic, on the other side of the ocean, in a city I had helped build without ever getting credit for it, 12 people sat around a table in a restaurant that had my name engraved on the walls. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to find out. Hannah had chosen the restaurant well. I had to give her that. The facade was elegant without being pretentious, in the way places with real history usually are. They don't need to shout about how good they are because the regulars already know. The large windows let in the morning light in a way that warmed the room without blinding anyone. The tables had that perfect balance of space and intimacy that makes a meal feel like an event, without being too formal. Hannah had made the reservation for 12 at one of the central tables in the main dining room, the most visible, the most beautiful, one of those tables that makes whoever sits there feel like they're at the center of something. She didn't know there was a private space in the back with her mother's name on the wall. She didn't know, and she hadn't asked. They arrived in trickles, the way large families do, in small groups, with that initial chaos of hugs and complaints about traffic, and chairs being dragged, and orders being placed before everyone had even sat down. Hannah arrived first with her husband, Philip, a man of few words who had learned over the years that in the Pickett family, it was better to listen than to speak. She looked sharp, hair done, carrying that energy of someone who organized an event and wants everyone to acknowledge the effort, despite the fact that the only real effort had been making a reservation and sending a group text expecting someone else to foot the bill. Robert arrived shortly after with his wife, Diane, and their 2 teenage sons, who immediately had their phones out and their attention elsewhere. Robert had that slightly distracted air of someone who is physically present, but whose mind is on something else, likely work or the numbers of some project he'd mentioned needing Sarah's signature on weeks ago. The younger daughter-in-law, married to Hannah's son, arrived with the baby and that specific brand of new mother exhaustion that makes any meal sitting down in a nice place feel like a genuine luxury, regardless of who's paying. Caleb arrived last. He came alone, as he usually did, with that quiet punctuality of someone who doesn't need an audience to enter a room. He wore a simple button-down, carried a small backpack, and when he entered the restaurant, he did something none of the others had done. He stopped. He looked around. He looked at the walls, at the old framed photographs tucked discreetly away, at the details of the space with the genuine interest of someone trying to understand where he was. The maitre d' who greeted him was a man named Renato, who had worked at the restaurant for nearly 15 years and had been briefed by Marco on what would happen that afternoon. Renato looked at Caleb and said softly, "Are you Mr. Caleb Pickett?" Caleb looked at him, slightly surprised. "I am." Renato pulled an envelope from his jacket's inner pocket and handed it over with both hands. "Mail for you, sir, with a request that it be read before lunch. Begins, if possible." Caleb took the envelope. He looked at the name written on the front in the handwriting he'd known since he was a child. His grandmother's handwriting. He went to the restroom to read it. Not because it was a particularly good place to read letters, but because it was the only place he could be alone for a few minutes without someone asking where he was or calling him to sit down. He opened the envelope carefully. Sarah's letter to Caleb was 3 pages long. It began like this. "Caleb, you are the only person in this family I don't need to explain myself to, because you are the only one who ever asked who I was before assuming you already knew." He read all 3 pages without stopping. When he finished, he folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and stood still for a moment, looking at his own reflection in the mirror above the sink. Then he took a deep breath. He left the restroom. He sat at the table with the family. He didn't say anything yet, but he tucked the envelope into his shirt pocket, over his heart, and waited. Lunch began with that artificial lightness of family reunions, where there is an unresolved tension that no one wants to be the first to name. Sarah's absence had been commented on early, as soon as it became clear she really wasn't coming. "She's being dramatic," Hannah said for the second time that day, this time to the whole table instead of into her phone. "You know your mother, Robert. She'll show up." Robert nodded, more out of habit than conviction. "Did anyone try calling again?" Diane asked. "Straight to voicemail," Hannah said. "She'll be here. She always is." Caleb said nothing. He looked at the menu, and that's when he saw it. In the bottom left corner of the menu, in a small but legible font, was a line he had never noticed the few times he'd eaten there with friends. "Original recipes, the Pickett family, since 1978. He stared at that line. Then he looked around the table to see if anyone else had noticed. No one had. Hannah was explaining something to Philip. Robert was buttering bread. The teenagers were on their phones. The baby was in its mother's lap. Caleb closed the menu slowly, and he began to notice other things. The photographs on the walls, the details of the space, the way the waiters moved with the familiarity of those who know every inch of the place. He signaled the waiter responsible for the table. "Excuse me," he said quietly, so as not to interrupt the conversations around him. "Does this restaurant have a special history? Founders? Anything like that?" The waiter, a young man who had been coached by Renato on how to answer this specific question if it were asked, said, "Yes, sir. It was founded in 1978 by Joseph and Sarah Pickett. If you're interested, we have a space in the back that holds the history of the place. The Adel Sarah Pickett room." The name dropped into the conversation like a stone in water. It wasn't loud enough for the whole table to hear, but Hannah, who was sitting right there, heard it. She turned her head toward the waiter. "I'm sorry," she said. What did you say that room was called? The waiter repeated it. Hannah stared at him for a second. Then she looked at Robert. Robert looked at her. Caleb watched them both with that neutral expression of someone who knows more than he's letting on. Must be a coincidence, Hannah said, turning back to her plate. Pickett isn't that uncommon of a name. It's our family name, Hannah, Robert said, sounding slightly uncomfortable. I know what our family name is, Robert. Then, it must be a coincidence, she repeated, with the firmness of someone decreeing Caleb said nothing. But he touched the envelope in his breast pocket, and he waited. Lunch continued. The appetizers came, then the main courses. The food was, objectively, extraordinary. The kind of food that makes conversation stop for a few seconds when the first forkful hits the mouth because the flavor demands attention. Hannah commented that it was very good. Robert agreed. Diane said it was the best roasted chicken she'd had in years. Caleb looked at Diane's roasted chicken. He thought about the recipe in his grandmother's book. He thought about the line on the menu. He thought about the letter in his pocket. He still said nothing. Dessert arrived. And with it came that natural expansion at the end of a meal, when the conversations get looser. Chairs lean back, someone orders coffee, and the room takes on that specific temperature of collective satisfaction. It was at this moment that Hannah looked around the table with the expression of someone checking off a mental list and said, "Well, this was great. Did anyone manage to get a hold of Mom?" General silence. "She's going to have to pay regardless," the daughter-in-law said, trying to lighten the mood with humor. "The reservation is in her name." A few polite chuckles followed. Caleb didn't laugh. "Is the reservation in her name?" he asked. "I put it in her name because she always covers it," Hannah said, with that naturalness of someone who doesn't realize what they are revealing about themselves. "It's just easier that way." Caleb stared at his sister for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Hannah, have you ever asked Grandma Sarah what she built in this life?" Hannah frowned slightly. "What does that have to do with—" "Have you ever?" he repeated. Silence. "She's our mother," Robert said, in that tone of someone who thinks that answers the question. "We know her." "Do you?" Caleb asked. It was at that moment that Renato, the maitre d', approached the table. He carried a tray. On the tray was the bill, inside one of those leather presenters that fine restaurants use to deliver the final amount with a certain elegance. And next to the presenter was an envelope. Renato placed the leather folder in front of Hannah, who had made the reservation. He placed the envelope in the center of the table. "From the owner," he said simply. And he walked away. Hannah looked at the envelope, then at Renato as he retreated. "The owner?" she said, more to herself than to anyone else. She opened the bill, presenter first, by reflex. She looked at the total. Then she looked at Robert with the expression of someone checking to see if anyone else was going to solve the problem before she had to solve it herself. "Her card isn't in here," Hannah said, looking around the table as if her mother's credit card might appear out of thin air. "She said she was in Italy," Caleb said. "She's not in Italy, Caleb." "She is," he said. "She boarded this morning." Silence. "How do you know that?" Robert asked. Caleb took an envelope from his breast pocket. He placed it on the table. "Because she wrote to me." Hannah looked at the envelope, at her mother's handwriting on the paper. Something shifted in her face at that moment. Not much. Just enough to show that, beneath the irritating certainty of someone who always knows what's going on, a small fracture was opening. "What does it say?" she asked. "A lot of things," Caleb said. "But first, open the envelope that came with the bill." Hannah picked up the envelope from the center of the table. She opened it. Inside was a letter folded in 3 and a business card. The business card had the name Marco, executive chef, and below the name, Pickett's, culinary director. Hannah read the name of the restaurant on the card. She read it again. She looked at Robert. Robert was looking at the menu he had grabbed from the next table, at the line in the bottom left corner that Caleb had seen earlier. Original recipes, the Pickett family, set year 1978. The letter Hannah held in her hands began like this. Dear family, if you are reading this, lunch has ended. I hope the food was good. Almost everything you ate today was born in my kitchen over 40 years ago. But let's start at the beginning. Hannah read aloud, not because anyone asked, but because when your hand starts to tremble slightly and your eyes meet, words that reorganize everything you thought you knew. Sometimes the only way to process it is to hear your own voice saying the things out loud to confirm they are real. The letter told the history of the restaurant, how it was born, what it had cost, what Sarah and Joseph had sacrificed in the early years, the recipes, the renovations, the sleepless nights, the suppliers, the partnership with George Whitmore, and what it had meant at a critical moment. It told of the Sarah Pickett room in the back. It told of the photograph Joseph had left behind. It told of the majority stake Sarah had just acquired from the Whitmore heirs. And then came the paragraph that made Hannah stop reading for a few seconds before she could continue. You chose this restaurant for a lunch, where I would pay the bill without being invited, without being thanked, without even receiving a Happy Mother's Day text. I'm not saying this to be hurtful. I'm saying it because it's true, and because truths spoken clearly are kinder than truths that rot in silence for decades. This place exists because Joseph and I built something real here, and today, while you had lunch here without knowing it, I was crossing the Atlantic on my way to a life that is finally my own. Complete silence at the table. The teenagers had put down their phones. The baby was sleeping in his mother's lap, oblivious to everything. Philip, Hannah's husband, stared at the tablecloth with the expression of someone who is present, but understands this is not the moment to exist out loud. Robert had his hands resting on the table and looked at the letter with an expression Caleb had never seen on his father's face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't defensiveness. It was something harder to name. Something like shame, but deeper than shame. More like the moment you realize you've been a version of yourself you don't like. Hannah finished reading the letter. She folded the paper, placed it on the table. She sat staring at it. It was Renato who appeared again, this time accompanied by Marco, the chef, who had come out of the kitchen specifically for that moment. Marco was a man with a natural presence, the kind who doesn't need to raise his voice to be heard. He approached the table and said, Good afternoon. My name is Marco. I've been the executive chef here for 18 years. He paused. I met Mrs. Pickett when I was still too young to fully understand what she had built. Over time, I came to understand. And I can say with all honesty that this restaurant is what it is because she wanted it to be this way. Every dish you ate today carries a piece of her. Hannah looked at him. Why are you telling us this? Because she asked me to, Marco replied simply. And because I think it's important for someone's family to know who that person is. Not just as a mother or a grandmother, but as someone who built something that will last long after all of us are gone. Silence. Did she leave us the bill? Robert asked, not with irony, but with the directness of someone who needs to understand the practical boundaries of the situation before they can process the rest. No, Marco said. The bill for this meal was covered by Mrs. Pickett as a gift. Not because she owed it to you, but because it was the last thing she wanted to do before leaving. He paused. Her words were, one, last time, from the heart, without anyone having to ask. Hannah stared at the tablecloth. Robert stared at the folded letter. Caleb stared at both of them. And then Hannah did something Caleb hadn't seen his mother do in many years. She cried. Not dramatically, not with sobs. With those silent, contained tears of someone who is crying in spite of themselves, who didn't want to be crying and is crying anyway, because some things are too big to fit inside the chest without overflowing. Philip placed his hand over hers. She didn't pull away. Robert wiped his eyes with his napkin in a way that was meant to seem casual, and didn't. Caleb waited. Then he said, with his usual calm, "She didn't leave angry with you." Hannah looked at him. "The letter she wrote to me," he continued, touching the envelope in his pocket, "ends by saying she loves us, that she always has. But that love isn't the same as self-erasure, that it took her 71 years to truly understand that, and she wasn't going to waste the time she had left." Silence. "And there's one more thing she asked me to tell you in person." They all looked at him. Caleb took the envelope from his pocket, opened it, read the last line of the letter aloud, with his grandmother's voice so present in those words that for a second it felt like she was there. "Caleb, tell them that the Sarah Pickett room is always open, for whenever they are ready to know who I was before I was their mother. There's no rush. I'll be in Sicily learning to make fresh pasta and finally sleeping in until 8 a.m. One of the teenagers, the eldest, Robert's son, who had spent the whole lunch on his phone, said in a low voice, "What room is that?" Marco, still standing near the table, made a gentle gesture with his hand. "If you'd like, I can show you." They went, all of them, even the baby, in his mother's arms, sleeping. They crossed the main dining room in silence, passed through the ornate wooden picket room, where it all began. And the photograph was there. Sarah, in her 30s, in an apron, in the old kitchen, her face turned to the side, laughing at something off camera, the window light creating that illumination that seemed calculated, but was just chance being generous. Hannah stood in front of the photograph for a long time. Then she reached out and lightly touched the frame, in the way of someone trying to understand something through touch that their eyes haven't quite managed to process yet. "I never asked," she said very softly, more to herself than to anyone. "I never asked anything about her life before us." No one answered, because there was nothing to answer. There was only that photograph on the wall, and 12 people looking at a woman they had presumed to know, discovering they had barely even begun. On the other side of the ocean, at that exact moment, Sarah Pickett was landing in Sicily. The air smelled of salt and lemons. She grabbed her suitcase from the carousel, walked through the airport exit, and stood for a second on the sidewalk with the sun hitting her face. She took her phone out of her pocket. There were 12 notifications in the family group chat. She closed the app without reading them, opened the camera, took a photo of the Sicilian sky, blue, and vast and completely indifferent to anyone's story. She put her phone away and walked toward the taxi that would take her to the Institute, with her suitcase in one hand and the rest of her life in the other. The Institute was in a small village 40 minutes from Palermo. The taxi climbed a road that wound between olive groves and vineyards, with the sea appearing and disappearing between the hills depending on the turn, that specific Mediterranean blue that I had seen in photographs, but that no photograph can ever truly capture, because it's a blue you feel beyond seeing. The driver tried to make conversation at the beginning of the trip. I spoke enough Italian to understand and to respond in parts, enough for him to conclude, with that practical insight of taxi drivers the world over, that I was someone who preferred looking out the window to talking. He respected that with a quiet elegance that I appreciated. I watched the landscape. Centuries-old olive trees with twisted trunks that seemed to have stories of their own. Sand-colored stone houses that seemed to have grown from the soil itself rather than being built. Gardens with lemon trees whose yellow fruit glowed against the green leaves, with an intensity that seemed almost artificial, almost too good to be real. I thought of Joseph. Not with sadness. With that longing that over time turns into something more like gratitude than loss. I thought how he would have loved this road, that he would have sat in silence looking out the window exactly as I was doing, and that every now and then he would have placed his hand over mine without saying a word, just to share the moment. That was one of the things I missed most, not the big declarations, the moments shared in silence. The Institute occupied an old estate, an 18th century building that had been restored with the specific care of someone who wants to preserve the soul of the place without mummifying it. The walls were stone, the ceilings were high, the windows opened onto an internal courtyard with a fig tree in the center that must have been at least 50 years old. The coordinator who had interviewed me via video was named Julia. She was a woman in her mid-50s, dark hair cut short, with a direct manner that hid a warm Sicilian hospitality that appeared in the details, in the handshake that lasted a second longer, in the way she personally checked if my room was in order before leading me to it, in the glass of lemonade that appeared in my hand before I could even ask for anything. "How was the flight?" she asked. "Long," I said. "And perfect." She smiled like someone who understands exactly what that means. My room was simple. A bed, a desk, a window looking out onto the courtyard, a small bookshelf, still empty. Ensuite bathroom with hand-painted blue and white tiles that made me stop and stare for a time disproportionate to the importance of the object. I put my suitcase on the bed, opened it. I took out the red apron first. It was folded exactly as I had placed it, that faded red from decades of washing that I had learned to love more than the original red, because it was proof that something had been used, had served, had participated in a real life. I hung it on the hook behind the door. I took out the recipe book, put it on the shelf. A single thing on an empty shelf has a presence that many things on a full shelf do not. I took out Joseph's letter, placed it inside the recipe book, between the usual pages. I closed the empty suitcase, went to the window. The garden below had that specific stillness of Mediterranean afternoons, when the heat weighs slightly in the air, and even the birds seem to have slowed down. The fig tree in the center cast a generous shadow over the stone benches around it. A woman I didn't yet know was sitting on one of those benches with a notebook in her lap, writing something with the concentration of someone who is completely inside what they are doing. I looked at her for a few seconds. I thought that in a few days I would know her name, her story, where she cooked from, and why she had come here. I thought that in a few weeks she would know the same things, about me. I thought there was something deeply good about that, in starting from zero with people who had no previous version of me to confirm or deny. I closed the window. I lay down on the bed with my clothes still on, my shoes still on my feet, and slept for 3 hours straight in a way I hadn't slept in months, without waking up in the middle, without thinking about bills or lunches or family group chats. I just slept. The Institute routine began the next morning. Communal breakfast at 7:30, at a long wooden table in the main kitchen where all the participants and some of the instructors gathered before the day's activities. It was a group of 12 people, from different countries, with different stories, united by the fact that they all had a serious, long-lasting relationship with the kitchen and wanted to learn something new. There was a 60-year-old Japanese chef who had spent 3 decades in a restaurant in Osaka. She gesticulated wildly when she spoke, despite her vocabulary in both Italian and English still being quite limited. There was a man from Morocco who had been a private family cook his entire adult life and who laughed easily and often. There was a woman from Mexico who was studying the relationship between Sicilian and Mexican cuisines. She had a theory about saffron that I didn't fully grasp, but which left me curious enough to want to hear more. Julia handled the introductions that first morning. When it was my turn, I gave my name, said where I was from, mentioned that I had helped found a restaurant decades ago, and that I had spent many years away from the kitchen for reasons that seemed important at the time. "And now?" Julia asked. "Now I'm here," I said simply. The Japanese chef, whose name was Fumiko, clapped her hands softly twice, a gesture I would later learn was her way of showing approval. The man from Morocco, Younes, gave a nod that means the exact same thing in any language. In that moment, I felt completely in the right place. Classes began that afternoon. The Institute's kitchen was a serious, well-equipped workspace, possessing that functional organization found only in places where people truly cook, rather than just perform. Each participant had their own station. The ingredients were Sicilian, local, seasonal, the kind that smells different the moment you open the crate. The first task was simple. Julia placed an eggplant, olive oil, garlic, salt, and fresh tomatoes in front of each of us. "Do what you would do at home," she said. "Don't try to impress anyone, just what you would make at home." I looked at those ingredients. I picked up the eggplant, and I cooked. I didn't think about technique. I didn't think about presentation. I thought about nothing but the eggplant in my hand, and what it could become. When the dish was ready, Julia tasted it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "This has memory. You can taste that this woman has done this many times before. That is priceless." Fumiko clapped twice. Younes smiled. I looked at the plate and thought that Joseph would have loved to hear that. The weeks that followed were the closest thing to rest I had experienced in decades, and I say that knowing it sounds like a paradox because I worked every single day. But there was a fundamental difference between that work and the work I had done in recent years. This work was mine. It wasn't for anyone else's sake. It wasn't to solve someone else's problem. There was no one waiting for me to finish so they could move on to the next demand. It was just me and the kitchen, and what I still had to learn and to offer. I learned about pasta alla norma from an 80-year-old Sicilian woman Julia brought in for an afternoon class. She taught by prepping ingredients with a quiet, steady speed that only comes from decades of loving repetition. I learned about using Bronte pistachios, that impossible vivid green pistachio unlike any other in the world. I learned about arancina, cannolo, and caponata, each with its own internal logic, its history, its why. And I taught too. I taught the herb-roasted chicken I had created 40 years ago, which had become the most requested dish at the restaurant. I taught the tomato sauce that simmered for hours over a low flame, the one my mother had taught me, which I had adapted until it was as much mine as it was hers. I taught the spiced caramelized squash I had invented one winter night when we had leftover pumpkins and a lack of ideas, resulting in something unexpectedly wonderful. As I taught, I realized how much I had accumulated over the decades without even noticing. Fumiko stood by my stove during the entire tomato sauce lesson, watching with that silent attention of hers. At the end, she said in her precise, sparing English, "You cook like one who loves, not like one who works." "It has always been the same thing for me," I said. She nodded as if that confirmed a theory she already held. I rarely used my phone. I had made a pact with myself before boarding the plane that I wouldn't let technology turn those 3 months into an extension of the life I had left behind. I checked messages once a day, at night, before bed. During the first 2 weeks, the messages from the family were frequent. Hannah wrote several times. She started with that defensive tone of someone processing an unpleasant surprise who hasn't yet reached the stage of taking responsibility. Then the tone shifted, very gradually, the way real tones do, not all at once, but in layers. Robert wrote less, but what he wrote was more direct. In the second week, he sent a message that said simply, "We went to see the Sarah Pickett room. We stayed there for a while. I didn't know about any of this, Mom. We need to talk when you get back." I replied, "When I get back, yes. Right now, I'm learning how to make cannoli." He replied with a heart emoji, which, for Robert, was the emotional equivalent of a keynote speech. Caleb wrote once a week. Not about the family, not about the restaurant, not about anything that had happened at that lunch. He wrote about other things, about a book he'd started, about a conversation with a friend, about a recipe he tried at home that turned out, in his words, edible but humiliating. I responded in the same spirit, about what I had learned that week, about Fumiko and Eunice and the woman from Mexico, Valentina, whose theory on saffron I had finally understood and found genuinely fascinating. About the Palermo market, where I went sometimes, on weekends, one of the most intense sensory experiences I'd had in decades. In one of his messages, he wrote, "You sound different in your texts, Grandma. More like you." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then I replied, "I am learning how to be." 1 month turned into 2. 2 turned into 3. And on an afternoon during the 3rd month, sitting in the courtyard with the fig tree casting a shadow over the stone bench where I had seen that woman on my first day, a notebook in my lap and a cup of coffee by my side, I wrote something I hadn't planned to write. I started at the beginning. My name is Sarah Pickett. I am 71 years old, and for nearly half a century my family believed I would always be there. I wrote for hours. I wrote about Joseph and the restaurant, about the years behind the scenes, the heart attack, the letter, the lawyer Mr. Ferrara, the room with my name, the red apron, the airport, the Sicilian taxi, the eggplant in the first class, and Fumiko clapping twice. I wrote things I had never said out loud. I wrote things I had said out loud, but that no one had ever truly heard. I didn't know what I was writing for. There was no defined recipient. It was just the need to get things from the inside out, to give shape to what had happened so I could look at it from a distance and understand. When I stopped writing, the sun had dipped considerably. Eunice was sitting on the other side of the fig tree, reading something. When he looked up and saw me, he gave that nod that meant everything is okay. And also, how was your day? And also, you don't need to explain a thing. I smiled. I closed the notebook. The final week of the program arrived before I realized it. There was a farewell dinner on a Thursday night with all the participants, instructors, and some local guests, held in an open space at the Institute, lit by lanterns that created an atmosphere artificial lighting can never quite replicate. Each had made the afternoon Joseph had stopped in my mother's kitchen doorway and stared as if he had never seen anyone cook before. The same dish that had been on the restaurant's menu for nearly 50 years. The same dish Diane had praised at that Mother's Day lunch, without knowing she was praising her mother-in-law's recipe. When people tasted it, the same thing happened that had happened decades ago. Conversation stopped for a few seconds. Julia closed her eyes while she chewed. Eunice said something in Arabic that I didn't understand, but his tone was clearly a compliment. Fumiko clapped twice. And I stood by the table thinking that some things endure not because they are perfect, but because they are true. And that truth has a flavor people recognize even when they don't know they're recognizing it. On the last night, Julia called me for a private talk in her office. We sat, with wine, which in itself said this wasn't a business meeting. She asked how the experience had been. I told her it had been more than I expected, which was saying a lot because I had expected a great deal. She smiled. "We have a visiting instructor program," she said. 2 months a year, here at the Institute, teaching and developing recipes with the participants. She paused. "We'd like you to consider it." I stared at her. 2 months a year, I repeated. 2 months a year, she confirmed. The rest of the time is yours, to do whatever you want. Stay here, go home, go somewhere else. But for 2 months a year, you'd come to teach. I thought for a moment. I thought of the restaurant waiting for me at home, the partnership I had acquired, the conversations that needed to be had, the things that needed to be said and heard face to face. I thought of Hannah and Robert and Caleb and the room with my name that they had finally visited. I thought of Joseph saying, "Go speak that language to the world." "I accept," I said. Julia raised her glass. We toasted. The flight back was scheduled for a Monday in September. On the Sunday afternoon before, I went to the Palermo market one last time. I bought Sicilian lemons, because they were impossible not to buy. I bought Bronte pistachios in a quantity that would likely be questioned at customs. I bought a small bottle of olive oil from a producer I had visited once during the program, whose oil had that final bitterness that indicates olives picked early and pressed fast, and I bought an apron. Blue, simple, linen, with that quality of something made to last. I packed it in my suitcase next to the red one. 2 aprons, the life I had lived, and the life that was beginning. The plane landed on a Tuesday afternoon. The airport had that familiar bustle, that specific smell of an enclosed space with too many people, that noise of suitcases and announcements and overlapping conversations that is the same in any airport in the world. I grabbed my bag from the carousel. I walked through the arrivals gate, and I stopped. Caleb was there. He hadn't cleared it with me. He hadn't said a word in his messages. But there he was, leaning against one of the lobby columns with that easy posture of his. And when he saw me, he raised his hand in a simple gesture that wasn't exactly a wave, but was more than a wave. I walked up to him. He hugged me. It was a long hug, the kind that conveys more than words can hold, the kind that says, "I know what you did and why you did it, and I'm here, and also I missed you, and I'm proud, and also simply it's good to see you." When he stepped back, he looked at me for a second. "You look different," he said. "You said that before." "This time it's more," he said. "More you, more relaxed. I can't quite explain it." "I know," I said. We got the suitcase. We went to the car. On the way, Caleb told me what had happened over the 3 months. Hannah had gone to the restaurant 3 times, not to eat, to talk to Marco, to hear stories, to see the photograph on the wall. On the 3rd visit, she had stayed for more than 2 hours in the Sarah Pickett room, looking at the old photos with an expression Caleb described as someone trying to reassemble a puzzle they had always assumed they knew the picture of without ever having put it together. Robert had asked to see the original partnership documents. He had spent an entire afternoon in Mr. Ferrara's office reading contracts from 40 years ago with the meticulous attention he always applied to numbers and had never applied to his own family's history. Both of them had written letters to me, real letters, on paper, which Caleb had in an envelope in the back seat. "They asked me to deliver them in person," he said. I took the envelope. I put it in my bag. I would read them at home, with coffee, in peace, the way letters deserve to be read. "And you?" I asked. "How are you?" He thought for a moment. "I learned how to make the roast chicken," he said. I looked at him. "How did it turn out?" "Honestly," he said, "it was good. Not the same as yours, but good." "It's never the same," I said. "Everyone makes it with what they have inside." He nodded as if that made sense beyond the cooking, because it did. We arrived home in the late afternoon. The neighbor had watered the plants. The garden Joseph had planted was alive and reasonably well tended for the time it had been neglected. The house had that specific smell of a place closed up for too long that dissipates quickly when you open the windows. I opened the windows. Caleb helped carry the suitcase. When he left, he paused at the door for a second. "The family wants to have a dinner," he said. "Whenever you're ready. No set date, no pressure, whenever you want." "A dinner where?" I asked. "At the restaurant," he said. "In the Sarah Pickett room. It was Hannah's idea. She wants you to be the host." I stared at him. That was Hannah's idea? It was Hannah's idea, he confirmed. I thought for a moment. I thought of 12 people sitting around a table in a space with my name on the wall. I thought of conversations that needed to be had face to face and with dignity. I thought of Hannah and the face Caleb had described, of someone trying to reassemble a puzzle. I thought of Robert reading 40-year-old contracts with the attention he had never dedicated to my story. I thought that rebuilding something takes longer than letting it deteriorate. But if there was one thing I had learned in 71 years, it was that some things worth having take exactly the time they take, and there is no shortcut. Tell Hannah yes, I said, when I'm ready. Caleb smiled. She'll be happy. I know, I said, and it's a start. After he left, I did the only thing that made sense. I went to the kitchen. I opened the empty refrigerator. I made a grocery list for the supermarket tomorrow. Then I sat at the table with the notebook I'd bought in Sicily, the one I'd spent hours writing in that afternoon under the fig tree, and opened it to a fresh page. I wrote down the date. I wrote down my home address. And then I wrote, slowly, in the handwriting Joseph always said was illegible, but that I found perfectly readable. Things I learned from 3 months in Sicily. I paused. I thought. Then I began to write. That real beginnings don't come with fanfare. They just have a first step that feels small, but changes everything. That cooking with someone is a way of trusting them. That longing and gratitude can live in the same place in your heart without canceling each other out. That love isn't the same as being constantly available. Love is showing up whole, when you do show up, rather than showing up in pieces all the time. That 71 is exactly the right age to start something new if that something is true. That Joseph knew who I was from day one. And that he left proof of it in places I only found once I was ready to find them. That my name is Sarah Pickett. And that this name belongs to me before it belongs to anything else. I closed the notebook. I walked over to the pantry door. The red apron was still on the hook. It had arrived before my suitcase, and I'd hung it up the moment I walked in, purely by instinct. I placed the blue apron right next to it. Red and blue. What had been, and what was beginning. I stared at the two of them for a moment. Then I smiled. Not the polite smile of someone trying to please. The smile of someone who should have but not too late, that she is actually the best company she could have.